The issue when discussing concepts and different models of reparations, one of the components is this idea of truth telling known as satisfaction. And how do you tell the truth about this heinous um, human rights violation, in this case, this racist anti-Black police violence? How do you tell the truth about that? And as a form of reparations, right? It's a way to make amends. And so when I was then drafting the speculative ordinance, people had discussed that we should do conversations about this, popular education about this. And I had decided to then include it in the speculative ordinance seeking reparations for the Chicago police torture survivors, and in this case, specifically the Burge torture survivors. So I thought to myself, well, what can the city of Chicago do to educate people regarding the Burge torture cases? And so I came up with the idea that the city of Chicago should teach it in Chicago public high schools. And that's where the idea came from. I think the Japanese redress movement, with respect to the federal legislation that got passed in 1988, provided grant money that would include various forms of education regarding the incarceration of people of Japanese descent during World War II. So there was funds allotted for that. I think also in North Carolina, there was legislation passed providing redress to people who had been forcibly sterilized. And that too included some compensation and popular education to talk about the forced sterilization movement, which was very racist and particularly affected Black women in North Carolina. So I think there was also some talk about that. Otherwise, it's often, when thinking about education, it's not often talked about as education in terms of teaching about the moment, but about providing funds or grants so that people who were directly affected or their family members, like children or grandchildren, can go get education at schools, et cetera. That was another component of our reparations legislation, but this was specifically about teaching about it, about the Burge torture cases. Often people can access those other programs, but then often they cannot. I think, but we know that school's mandatory for all children, and I think it should be part of the mandatory curriculum to have to discuss this in Chicago public high schools. I would hope that private high schools do it. I would hope that other programming, churches, youth, et cetera, would also take it on. But with respect to the reparations legislation, this was a demand made on the city of Chicago. This was a demand implicating the city of Chicago in this pattern and practice of racist torture. And it was saying to the city, how are you going to provide reparations? And the city of Chicago is responsible for Chicago public schools. It's responsible for their budget. It's responsible for other things related to the schools. So this was a demand on the government to take accountability and responsibility for this and say, what are you going to do with the programming and other agencies that you are responsible for in providing for reparations? And so that's why I think, in this case, I think it's super important that it be included in the Chicago public high schools and elementary schools, that this is something the city of Chicago controls and therefore could mandate. Many of the teachers were really interested in it. I think they welcomed it. I think this was at a time that after the murder of Mike Brown and the murder of Sandra Bland, that caused many uprisings in 2015, and I think was the first tidal wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think there were many teachers who were hungry and looking for lesson plans that included issues around police violence, and particularly racially motivated police violence, because so many young Black and brown people in the city of Chicago have really awful, negative, harrowing experiences with Chicago police officers, particularly when it comes to stop and frisk issues. And so they were welcoming an opportunity to discuss issues around policing and racially motivated state violence and create a space to not only be able to teach about it, but to also create a space so that their students could also hear, learn from others, as well as share their own experiences. And I think often there's no spaces in classrooms where people can share these experiences, but they have a lot of trauma and they need to have an opportunity to be able to discuss it, explore it, learn from others. And I think it's a really empowering experience for many of the students to have some of the Chicago police torture survivors come in and speak with them, not only about what the survivors went through and how they're resilient and persevered and still here, which is an important model, an important lesson, an important inspiration, but then to be able to talk with them about what they experienced as well and realizing that they are not alone. When the curriculum started to be drafted, the city of Chicago had already consulted some outside agency to help them draft the curriculum. And they really thought it was going to be somewhat of like a know your rights curriculum. Like, here's the First Amendment, here's the Fourth Amendment, here's the Fifth Amendment, here's the Sixth Amendment. And we were like, no. And we were like, that is not what this is about. This is about teaching about the Burge torture cases. It's about teaching about the torture that occurred, about, and then also teaching about the organizing to seek justice on behalf of the torture survivors and to try to right these wrongs, and particularly then about the reparations movement. And so I think over time, it became about wanting to put this into context and wanting to, have a larger context around police violence and racially motivated police violence in the city of Chicago, but and as well as including the resistance to it and the resilience and perseverance of torture survivors, family members, and other organizers in, staying the course and seeking justice. I think those were the key principles to really hit home about. And doing a lot of work around state violence and police violence, and also writing about these issues with co-authors in this book called Queer Injustice, the criminalization of LGBT people in the United States. I think it's always important that in addition to discussing these heinous acts of violence, that we also uplift people who are resisting those acts of violence. And that resistance has always come with state violence. And I think to erase that resistance, which often gets erased, and I think particularly the organizing work done by organizers gets erased. I think for me, it was really important that that be included in this curriculum.